So our cells are the basic functional unit of our bodies. But our bodies consist of numerous cells, and those cells are not identical to each other. So there's different types of cells that make up our bodies. And in fact, the way our bodies are organized is that cells of a similar type tend to be found in association with each other. And those associations we call tissues. And the tissues are organized into different types of tissues, are together organized into what we call organs. And then we have something called organ systems. And a lot of what we'll be doing in this course is going through the various organ systems and describing how they work and what contributions they make to the body. As I've said, cell biology, at the base of all of this are these cells that have functions, and it is how the cells work that ultimately gives rise to those functions, and you have to study the cell biology of the cells, understanding what's going on inside the cells in order to understand how it is that they function. But to a large extent, we can, in studying human biology, just consider the cells to be a black box where you have some kind of input going into the cell, some kind of output coming out of the cell, and to a large extent, not 100%, but to a large extent, we can just ignore the details associated with what goes on inside of the cell. So we often can ignore the cell biology. The other side of the cell biology is that the cells are living things. They have to stay alive. They have to keep themselves alive. And their cell biology is a description of how it is that they keep themselves alive. The functions they need to go through in order to continue to be functioning cells within the body. So the process of having these tissues, these cells of different types, involves something known as cellular differentiation. And cellular differentiation is the taking during development and also during repair and replacement of the cells in our body. It's the taking of cells, and as they divide, they become more specialized. And their specialization is you convert something from a stem cell, as they're known, into something such as a nerve cell or a muscle cell, a blood cell, a skin cell, the adipocyte, the adipose tissue cells that we just took a look at. So this process of dividing our cells become more and more specialized. Typically this specialization is not reversible, so that once a cell has become, say, a muscle cell, it's not going to become some other type of cell. And the process of differentiation involves going from a cell that basically is capable of giving rise to any kind of cell in our bodies to becoming a cell that, for example, can only give rise to a muscle tissue cell or nervous tissue cell. And so there's this increasing specialization. But the cells that actually do the dividing and give rise to different cell types are known as stem cells. We've got 4 different types of basic tissues in our bodies. These are the epithelial tissue, these are the connective tissue, these are the muscle tissue, and these are the nervous tissue. I did say 4, right? I didn't repeat myself. Good. But there's actually 3 even more basic tissue types. And these are the embryonic tissue types, the initial germ layers as they're described. And this is something known as the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. And so what I'm going to do, fittingly, is to start out and talk a little bit about early embryonic development and the early differentiation, cellular differentiation that occurs there that gives rise to these 3 basic types of tissues, which ultimately are going to give rise to all of the tissues, all the cell types that make up our bodies. So, in the beginning, we have a sperm and an egg. And we can talk about where sperm and eggs come from, but that'll be far distant in our in the course of our discussion of human biology. So, a sperm, it's a cell that has a tail, and the eggs are much bigger than the sperms. Much bigger. I mean, we're talking about the sperm actually is, you know, like that big compared to the egg. But the sperm carries inside of it what is described as an N complement of genetic material. It's half of the total amount of genetic material that's associated with a normal human cell. And so too, inside of their cell nuclei is the egg cell contains these N complement, a haploid complement of DNA. And they get together. Oh, I do have orange. Woohoo! They get together and you end up with this 2N cell, which is our zygote. So this is the diploid cell that makes up the normal human body cells. So we all know this. Egg and sperm get together. You end up with a fertilized egg, and the fertilized egg is called the zygote. Now, the fertilized egg, it's got to implant, and it has to produce these extra embryonic membranes that surround the developing embryo. In fact, it ends up with legs and arms and a head and a heart. But that's all complicated stuff and besides the point. What we're going to talk about is the very early embryonic development. And actually, appropriately, mostly because I ran out of time making my breakfast this morning, eggs, these are actually unfertilized eggs, I'm told. But you'd think, actually I should have made sure I had access to it. So our eggs are big, but of course chicken eggs are even bigger. Most of what the chicken egg is all about is basically a storage of materials, of nutrients that will be used in the course of the development of the egg. Because unlike us, the chicken has to basically, supply its embryos with all the nutrients they're ever going to have before they hatch inside of the individual egg. Whereas with us, we supply our nutrients to the embryo from the mother's body, and so our eggs don't need to be nearly this big because they don't need to have a lot of what's known as yolk. Breakfast. Well, maybe at this point, it's brunch. Those are obviously a hard-boiled egg. Those are fresh eggs from bantam chickens. You get like 4 to 6 of them. They currently live in our basement so they don't freeze to death. In fact, yesterday we had a chicken that died. Was it yesterday? I think it was yesterday. Maybe it was the day before. We had a chicken that died that my daughter had had for 9 years. So this is a special chicken that died. But at any rate, so if that was a fertilized egg, the sperm would be meeting the egg before the shell went on, and you would end up with this zygote, and then the zygote would go through something called cleavage. And in cleavage, what you get is an increase in the number of cells. Those should be the same size. But it's not an increase in the total volume. Basically, they're going through mitosis and cytokinesis, that's cell division. Where the cells are getting more numerous, but they're also becoming I'll put more than one arrow there. they're also becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And what you're developing in the course of this is a solid ball of cells called a morula. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that something close to correctly. So you've got this solid ball of cells. It's more cells than just that. Lots more cells. It's not just 16 cells. It's, hundreds of cells at this point. Now, the morula develops into something called a blastula. And the blastula, so this is just looking at this as a two-dimensional object, but it would be a ball, just like this would be literally a ball, a sphere of cells. The blastula looks like this. These cells are connected to one another, even if I'm inadvertently not drawing them quite like that. So it's a hollow ball of cells. And it's a sphere, it's a ball. This is just looking at it in cross-section. So this is the blastula. Okay. And the blastula has inside of it a blastocele. Let's make sure it's not written down up there. That's the interior volume. We talked about body cavities, right? So that's kind of like an embryonic cavity. It is a cavity that's completely surrounded by cells. It's essentially, if you had a beach ball or a basketball, the outside, the ball part would be the cells, and then there'd be a volume inside. Except in here, the volume is not filled with air, it's filled with a fluid. But that's the blastocele. Now, the next step is something called gastrulation. We're getting to the whole point of this. And in gastrulation, what you end up with is an invagination. So I'll now draw this using lines rather than balls, just because it's easier to do so. But you end up with this ball of cells that has this invagination. And the invagination continues. So again, this is the blastocele, this is that volume. But the invagination is the outside world impinging itself upon the interior of the blastula. And you end up with something that looks something like this. So that is known as the archenteron. And this opening right here is the blastopore. And the archenteron is considered to be the primitive gut. It is the primitive location of the cells that are responsible for bringing nutrients into our bodies. It eventually will develop into our guts. It's the beginning of our guts. And so our bodies basically have an outside, and then they have a tube that runs from the mouth to the anus where we do our digesting of our food and absorption of our food. And this is the beginning of that tube. So this is really the outside of the organism. If we were talking about a chicken egg, there would be yolk. Of course, chickens are much more complicated in what they look like in terms of their embryos at this stage. But there would be the yolk in association with the cells that are lining the archenteron. And it would be from that yolk that the nutrients are derived and brought into the chicken over these primitive gut cells, the ones that line the archenteron. Now ultimately, and this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, ultimately we have both a mouth and an anus. And in us, we have another opening that is derived. So it comes after the first opening. So we have a first opening and then we come up with a second opening. In us, this second opening is the mouth. And the blastopore becomes the anus. That's because we're deuterostomes, as it's described. That means second mouth. The protostomes are described using that term because the blastopore becomes their mouth, and the second opening becomes their anus. So there's two basic types of animals that have mouth and anus. The ones that have the mouth as the second opening includes us, the vertebrates, but also the echinoderms, which include the starfish. So it's an interesting combination of creatures. But at any rate, the cells that line the archenteron and ultimately are associated with the rest of the gastrointestinal tract that develops from that. These cells are called endodermal cells. So endoderm. So the endoderm is one of the basic types of tissues. And it's the tissue, obviously, that is associated with our means of acquiring nutrients. And it's created by this invagination. We have cells that remain on the outside, and these become our skin and also our nervous tissue, because our nerves are derived from that same tissue. And that's on the outside. I probably shouldn't have used the same color. That was silly. No, maybe I didn't use the same color. You can't tell the difference on here between the orange and the yellow. But that is called ectoderm. So we have endoderm lining the archenteron and ectoderm on the outside. This is the earliest cellular differentiation. Remember, our bodies have specialized cells, specialized tissue. The process of development is going from this fertilized egg to all of these specialized tissues and the associated anatomy morphologies. And that process of going from one end to the other, from egg to a mature body, is a process of development. And this is the early stages of development. It's the early stages of cellular differentiation. So that's the endoderm and the ectoderm, but there are three layers. And the third one is the mesoderm. Green. We haven't used green yet. So the mesoderm forms in here. Its formation is more complicated than that of the ectoderm and the endoderm. Oh. Oops. That's the mesoderm. So you've got these three layers. You've got the, in a sense, inside. Remember, that's facing the outside of the animal's body. It happens to be an outside that's inside. It's facing into our gut, but that really is outside of our body, except it's enclosed within our body, but it's still outside of our tissues. So that's the endoderm. We have the ectoderm, which is the covering of our bodies, and we have the mesoderm, which is the middle. Now the mesoderm gives rise to things like muscles. And remember we talked about body cavities. So body cavities form inside, so these are volumes. These are not empty spaces, they have fluid and they usually have organs inside of them. But these are volumes, and they're volumes that are found inside of mesodermal tissue. So we have what will become the gut. It's lined by epithelial tissue ultimately, that it comes from this endodermal tissue. We have the outside of the animal, and this is covered with what will be skin, for the most part, in us. And this comes from ectodermal tissue, as does also our nervous tissue. And we have between them this mesodermal tissue, which you can think of as basically being muscles. Although there's more to it than that. But within these muscles are these volumes, and those are called body cavities. I'll continue to use green. Body cavity. And these are also called coelums. I know, weirdly spelled word. In fact, we're described as coelomates because we've got these body cavities, these coelums. So endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm in the middle. Within the mesoderm are body cavities. And the body cavities are lined with serous membranes.